Welcome to the History of Psychology Show. I'm your host, Christopher Green from York University in Toronto, Canada. For our 8th episode, I have Jeremy Burman from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Jeremy has been working on aspects of Jean Piaget's developmental theory that almost no one knows about. For several years, he worked at the Piaget archives at the University of Geneva in Switzerland, and he has a take on Piaget which is probably unknown to you. The short version is that North Americans' understanding of Piaget is really based only on a small slice of Piaget's overall theory, a theory that developed from the 1920s all the way up to his death in 1980. So I hope you enjoy listening to Jeremy. I should confess up front that just like last week, Jeremy was one of my PhD students several years ago, but I think he has really interesting things to say and that you'll enjoy hearing them. Oh, I should note before we get started that we had a little bit of trouble with the audio because Jeremy and I were separated by an entire ocean and then some. So the video and the audio are a little out of sync early on in the interview, but it corrects itself a few minutes in. I hope you enjoy it. Jeremy Burman, welcome to the History of Psychology Show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Chris.
That's great. We want to talk about Piaget. You have some interesting views about Jean Piaget. We're going to start with a little review, and then we'll get into some of those interesting views. Jean Piaget is, of course, widely known as one of the great developmental psychologists of the 20th century. And his best-known work, at least in North America, focused on how children's ability to think becomes more sophisticated as they grow. The most notable feature of his theory was that children's thinking doesn't improve gradually, as one might expect, but that it remains stable for a few years at a time and then more or less all of a sudden leaps up to a new level of sophistication. So could you please first remind us of the stages of cognitive development as Piaget had them, and summarize some of the classic tasks that Piaget used to assess what stage a child was at?
To start right at the beginning, little babies can only do really basic things. They have the rooting reflex, the palmar grasp, monkey stuff. And by around 2 years of age, they have objects. They don't start with objects. That's the thing that has to be constructed. The notion that there are objects in the world is not something that a little baby starts with. And around 2, they also have language that others can understand. So at the end of the sensorimotor stage, at the end of that first spooky stage, children start to become actively social, and the world they're in then changes in a fundamental way. It moves from a world of sensations into a world of objects. And that's actually a really cool idea, this notion that objects don't exist for really, really young children, and it's something that has to be constructed. This is one of the really famous ideas attached to the sensorimotor stage. It's called object permanence. And the philosophers who bang on tables don't know about object permanence. The point, the bang that the table is really real, they're missing that fundamental thing that Piaget offers. Tables are only tables because we have the idea that they're objects. And some of those objects are flat surfaces around mid-thigh that you can put stuff on. But otherwise, they're patterns of light and dark and some color with a noise when that angry man over there bangs on it.
So if I can interrupt for just a second, what do you think the relationship is then between the way Piaget views the infant's world and, say, William James's blooming, buzzing confusion? Are they similar, or are there differences between those two?
They're similar, and Piaget cites James, and he gets that through Edouard Claparède, the founding director of the Rousseau Institute that we'll talk about later, I think. Claparède is a functionalist, and he's buddies with James and Baldwin and all the other Americans. Piaget also gets it through Pierre Janet, who was another of James's friends, and also probably is best known for 2 reasons. One, Janet had a priority dispute with Sigmund Freud over who invented psychoanalysis, and 2, Janet is the connection between Piaget and Baldwin. He and Baldwin had lunch every Wednesday for many years in Paris after Baldwin left what is it, Johns Hopkins, because of the sex scandal.
Right. So back to, I guess, pre-operational. We were in pre-operational.
Yeah. This notion that really, really young children don't have objects yet makes Piaget a kind of a neo-Kantian. So, Kant's famous argument separating noumena and phenomena. We don't have objects, we don't have access rather to the objects in themselves. We only have access to the phenomena that are attached in some way to those objects, and then we work with that. So Piaget builds on this foundation of sensations. From the sensations, objects are constructed somehow, and he explains how later. And then from objects, there's another construction on top of that. So from objects, the formal operational stage is about imaginary possibilities. And those are really the stages. It's the stage of sensations and the stage of objects and the stage of well, there's two stages of objects, and then the stage of imaginary possibilities. There's a lineage, they're connected. If you don't have sensations first, then you can't build objects from them. And if you don't have objects, then you can't have imaginary objects. You have to have each of those things.
How does the concrete operational stage fit into there then?
So yeah, concrete operational is well, there's two operational stages. There's what's called pre-operational from like 2 until 7, and then the concrete operational, which is like 7 until 13, 14. The ages are not important, but that kind of situates you. The concrete operational period or stage, well, is famously the stage of conservation tasks. What's the really well-known one from textbooks, where you have a tall skinny glass and a short fat glass, and you move water in between them, and a early pre-operational, like, so before the child can conserve, the pre-operational child will say there's less water because the glass is shorter, and they're indexing the amount of water on their observations about the glass. And conserver, so a concrete operational reasoner, will recognize that you have to coordinate both the height and the width, and also that the water has identity. So the water might be moving and it might look different, but the water after the transformation is identical with itself. That issue of identity becomes important later for what Piaget calls formal operational reasoning. And the formal operations are everything that adults can do, and it's logic and it's propositional statements and all of the transformations that we expect to have, that develops, and that appears in the kind of mid-teens.
Right.
And those are the 4 stages.
Right. So in the concrete operational stage, we can kind of move, well, concrete objects, I guess, if you like, and they can be manipulated and we can understand things about them. But in the formal operational stage, we're talking about concepts and numbers and, like you said, propositions, things that aren't concrete but are still objects of thought in some sense. Yeah,
that's exactly right. So imaginary objects, laws, abstractions, the adult world, really, and the thing that Piaget was especially interested in, which is science and mathematics.
Right.
How are science and mathematics possible when children are pretty useless?
That's great. We'll get to that. I think that's a really important point, that Piaget's sort of ultimate aim is to explain how science and other kinds of sort of adult knowledge are possible from creatures that begin as human infants. But let's talk about the spooky language first. So, assimilation and accommodation and equilibration, how do those fit into this?
Yeah, these are I think the first 3 things that everybody hears about Piaget. Yeah, they're spooky, but it's not complicated. It's assimilation to something. So you're bringing it in. Piaget talked about how the rabbit, you can imagine a rabbit who eats cabbage. The rabbit assimilates the cabbage. It brings it in. And then there's an accommodation of something. So in this rabbit example, the rabbit is assimilating the cabbage, and then the cabbage becomes part of the rabbit, and the rabbit changes according to what's in the cabbage. So the accommodation is of the rabbit, the accommodation is of the structures, and the whole thing is equilibrated. So assimilation, bring it in, accommodation, change it, and why are you changing it? How are you changing it so that it's equilibrated?
Right.
And that's it's not that hard as soon as you work with it at all. Part of what's complicated, though, is what it is that's being assimilated to and what it is that's being accommodated. And this doesn't sound as spooky. He called it operational structures. And that gets reinterpreted in behaviorist America as cognition, especially after World War II. And that's only partly right. Piaget says cognitive, and he doesn't mean cognitive, even though they're spelled the same and they sort of look the same and they sound the same. It's a false friend. They're not identical. Cognitive and cognitive are not the same.
So what does cognitive mean then?
Well, cognitive is the set of operational structures that produce all of the things that cognitive psychologists expect, like memory and intelligence. But the way that happens is different. So like a really famous, a book called Memory and Intelligence tracked the relationship between what looks in French like cognitive and memories. And Piaget and Inhelder, very important to recognize Barbel Inhelder, his deputy, and she basically ran the experiments after about the 1950s. Right. So the really cool thing about Memory and Intelligence, this book, is that it showed that memory is partly a reflection of what's cognitive. That after a stage change, stage theory isn't really stage theory, it's a bunch of substages too. So this notion of plateaus isn't right. But after a big change, memory improves in ways that it shouldn't. So a kid within a stage would show the normal degradations of memory that you expect from Ebbinghaus and everybody else. But the kids who go after, who have a transition in between the pre and post test, have better memories. Why should that be? And it's because they're reprojecting their memories through a more complex system, and they're reinterpreting their memory in ways that it now makes sense according to their new way of interacting the world and seeing the world.
Right. So
I think that's so cool.
Could we say that they've got a more sophisticated conceptual system, and that allows them to organize their memories in a way that makes them more retrievable and more articulable and things like that?
We could say that, but it's also like the memories themselves, the stuff that makes the memories is like, it's not information retrieval. It's not information processing. That's American stuff after. This is before all of that. So it's, so that American version, and this is important, the Americanized version is, as Robbie Case put it in his book, it's the mind's staircase. And so humans climb it and they stop at different plateaus, as you said, and we can call those plateaus milestones if we want. And those milestones are associated with different ages. So we can put age ranges, as I did when I talked about it, on those plateaus, even though that's not what Piaget cared about. And that's part of the Americanization. So we're reading Piaget through Arnold Gesell, we're reading him through Havighurst, and that's not what he was interested in. It's all maturation, and he's interested in development. And actually, that's one of the things that he directly said he got from James Mark Baldwin is the problem of genesis, as he referred to it. So
let's talk about the difference a little bit more, because I'm not entirely clear on it. So there is this sense of children do roughly the same thing for a while, and then they seem to develop quite rapidly, and then they do roughly the same thing for a while, but we don't want to call those stages. Can you explain to me what the difference is, what you're trying to avoid by describing Piaget in this other way?
Yeah, if you look at the different tasks, so there's not just the conservation experiment with the water in this short glass and the skinny glass. There's the same thing with beads. There's the same thing with clay and rolling it out, and the different tasks that are used then give you different lineages, and so the performance on the different tasks can shift around, even within a stage. So within a stage, there's he breaks it up into substages, and the number of substages depends. And he then looks at those substages and characterizes the performance inside of that and breaks it up. And so he keeps breaking it down. The stages are better thought of as names rather than fundamental. They're not essences, they're constructions. That any clearer?
A bit. We'll keep talking, and I'm sure it'll become clear as we go on. So let's go talk about Piaget's background, which is really quite interesting. He's Swiss by birth, and he spent most of his career in Geneva, writing mostly in French. His books were only translated into English later, for the most part, sometimes much later, after the theory that he was now working on was different from the theory he'd written about, 10 or 20 years before. But he didn't start off as a psychologist. What was his upbringing like?
Well, his parents are Swiss, but they have English names. So his father is Arthur Piaget, and his mother is Rebecca Jackson. Arthur was a professor of history and philology, which is the study of linguistic meanings as they change over time, at the Academy of Neuchâtel, which became the University of Neuchâtel in 1909. He was also the state archivist for decades for whichever canton Neuchâtel is in, I can't remember which. And he was a journal editor for decades and decades as well. And then before Jean Piaget joined the Academy of Neuchâtel, he was rector for a couple of years as well. There's some sort of connection to the Piaget watch company. We don't know as much about Piaget's mom. She's another one of these underappreciated women. I mentioned Barbel Inhelder earlier. The conservation task with the water is Alina Szyminska. And that's really important because in English, her name is not on the cover of the book. She's not a named co-author, but in French, she's a co-author. Anyway, his mom is Rebecca Jackson, as I said, and he blamed her probably unfairly for his various crises when he was a teenager, and especially her religiosity. His philosophical awakening as a teenager was when his godfather introduced him to Bergson. And this
is Henri Bergson, the French philosopher. Yeah.
The big revelation of Bergson is that you can be philosophical without also being theological. So there's a separation from his mother's approach, but in his thinking, the combination that seems to be important is the combination of Bergson with Auguste Sabatier, who was the dean of the Protestant Faculty of Theology in Paris and a professor at the Sorbonne. Piaget found a book by Sabatier in his dad's library, and the combination led him to what looks like the beginnings of equilibration. Sabatier has dialectical ideas, and so and Piaget published an essay in 1914 called Bergson et Sabatier. So we have the élan vital of Bergson and the dialectics of Sabatier, and maybe that could be the earliest seed of equilibration that later he develops.
Right. But even as a teenager, he starts doing biological experiments, even publishes paper, right?
Oh, he published a stack of papers. He thought by writing, and that's sort of nice because we can track his thinking and how it developed, but it's also sort of a curse because there's so much material, and we are flawed creatures, and remembering it all is kind of a pain in the butt. And then trying to make connections across the 100 and something books and the 700 articles, it's a real nuisance. So every time I look at my sources, I see something different. It's like the sources are changing as I'm changing, which is kind of a Piaget thing to say, right? Mm-hmm. They're the same objects, but they're different thoughts. His snail hunting, he did publish a lot about the snails. And these are natural histories. I went to this place, I looked in these ways, and I found these snails that have these characteristics, and we can name them thusly. So there's this species over here and that species over there. And so he did a lot of that. And that was the basis of his first doctorate, ultimately.
Oh, really? So that's work that continued on into his university years. So let's talk about that. So smart kid, publishing papers. decides to go to university. Where does he go? What does he go into?
Well, that's complicated, like everything, right? The University of Neuchâtel was integrated with the Gymnase in Neuchâtel. So his teachers in what we would think of as high school, that's probably closer to CEGEP. It's like the academic stream, pre-university preparatory academic stream.
Gymnase is, like an academic high school across various parts of Europe. France has one too. In Germany.
And there's different names for them. Gymnasium is the translation, but that's awkward for English speakers because gymnasium usually means the big room where we play sports inside.
Right.
And that's not at all what this is. It's a
not the fancy academic high school that we prepare for university at.
Yeah, it's an elite school. So he had teachers during his Gymnase years that are also professors from the University of Neuchâtel. Oh. And so that's really integrated. And his doctorate is also integrated with his high school. The result is that he got his doctorate when he was 22. And the most important influence, though, probably was his studies in philosophy and also in psychology with Arnold Reymond. Reymond is the person that he decided to do a second doctorate with later, but he met in Neuchâtel in his Gymnase, and then followed with Reymond through what we would think of as his bachelor studies, leading to his first doctorate. So and in his autobiography, he describes the interactions with Reymond as being very important for the development of his thinking. He's a snail hunter guy. He's a snail guy, and he's listening to blah blah logic, don't care. He's probably fantasizing about going to look in a pond he hasn't looked in yet. And he's half listening to Reymond talk about how logic can be used in various ways, one of which, Monsieur Piaget, is to formalize the notion of a species as a logical whole with interchangeable parts. So you can translate inside that whole, and Piaget wakes up and all of a sudden he's excited to be there. And that becomes the key he says, the key insight that drives everything forward. That was the piece that he was missing. And his doctorate then is about species grouping. His dissertation is about local snails and where to find them. But through the idea that if you can collect enough specimens of whatever, in this case snail shells, then you can define the grouping that they belong to and see how the groupings blend together or blur together, if it's continuous or if it's discontinuous. And that's the 1918 project. That's the dissertation. Right. This is not at all what people expect when they hear that Piaget has a biology.
Right. But it was much more continuous than that. It wasn't like he did one thing and then he switched to another thing. The philosophy informs his biology all the way through and eventually turns into a study in its own right. Yes. Yeah,
and he continued publishing in biology until 1929. So that, like, his famous books in psychology that Vygotsky criticized are from 1922 and 1923, and he continues publishing about snails until 29, and then he stopped for decades and came back into it in the 60s.
Right.
That's later. We can talk about that.
He also works with some very famous people in the history of psychology. In the 1910s, he's briefly with Carl Jung and Eugen Bleuler at the famous hospital, Bergolzi.
I don't remember the name of the hospital where he was, but I know he was in Zurich, and he wasn't there that long. He was there for 4 months.
It was just 4 months. And is there any residue of that interaction in other work, or is it just something he did for a few months?
He published a bunch that's psychoanalytic and in psychoanalytic journals. His first psychological article is in a psychoanalytic journal. And he says that they weren't doing things that are interesting or fundamental, and he gave up on them. And that's not right. His interviewing style that he used in Paris seems to be psychoanalytic, and he refers to it later as a psychiatric interviewing style. But where is he going to learn psychiatric interviewing? And in French, in Switzerland at that time, psychoanalysis and psychiatry aren't distinguished. So when he says, I use psychiatric interviewing. He's talking about stuff that he learned from Jung and Pfister and Bleuler. And
right. So after that, he goes off to Paris and works again with a couple of famous people from the history of psychology, Alfred Binet and Théodore Simon.
Not Binet.
Not Binet.
Because Binet died when Piaget was 15. So there's no way that
that's right.
Piaget worked with, there's no way that he worked with Binet.
That's right. But he worked on the Binet-Simon test, the famous intelligence test, yes?
He worked in the lab. And this is actually really important, that he worked in the lab, but he didn't have a supervisor. Simon was in Rouen, which is like 3 hours by contemporary means of travel. I have no idea how long it would take in 1920. Paris, 21 to get there. So he was in the lab doing his own thing. The task that he was given, his mandate, was to standardize Cyril Bert's, the intelligence test. The job that he was hired to do was to standardize the British test for use with French children.
Right.
And that was really boring. So because he didn't have a supervisor and he didn't have to do what they told him to do, he went off script and he started asking the children why they were giving the wrong answers. So in other words, he started using these psychiatric, really psychoanalytic interviewing techniques to ask about intelligence test items. And he found in the process of doing all that children gave all sorts of interesting justifications for their wrong answers. And not only that, the justifications seemed to group. So, but because he wasn't interested in the age and he wasn't interested in the intelligence, he was investigating the groupings and how those groupings changed. He was doing a collection of children, just like he had done a collection of the snails. Yeah. So now we see the transition between psychology and snail stuff and how they're really blurred together. So his first non-psychoanalytic psychological article then looks at exactly this question of what is the relationship between parts and wholes, and that was published in 1921, which is the year he left Paris and went to Geneva.
Right. This strikes me as the era, there's kind of a revolutionary moment here where he's working on this test that measures intelligence entirely on a gradualist scale, right? The kid has a mental age of 6 years and 0 months, or 6 years and 2 months, or 6 years and 4 months. And, they're task by task by task, they get another couple of months in their mental age. And he's going, no, they're all doing roughly the same thing. And then boom, they all move to a different level. Like you have this stage-wise development rather than the gradualist development. Do you see it that way, or am I imputing?
At that point, it's the justification. It's the style of explanation that they give. And so when you are collecting together like snail shells, they vary all over the place, right? So there's a continuous collection of shells, just like there's a continuous collection of performance on intelligence tests. But then he groups them, and he, according to his interpretation of how they are justifying their wrong answers, and then the grouping becomes the discrete object that then looks like a flat stage, like you're climbing a staircase, because you're moving between those groups, even though the groups are continuous within them. So it's a move where he's interpreting the collection as if it were following Reymond's lesson about logic, but especially interpreting those intelligence test results as if they're snails.
What if instead of saying stage, we said, look, there's a cluster of things here that have sort of family resemblances among themselves, and then they seem to be more or less separated from some other cluster of responses that seem to have family resemblances among themselves? Would that be a better image than stages, than stairs?
Yeah, and I think if psychology were more connected to biology and more, if we were more aware of the history of biology, discussions like this are issues of species definition. And that's totally straightforward. That like everyone is familiar with. Well, what's Dick Lewontin's famous thing from the 70s? There's more variation within groups than between them.
Yeah.
Yeah. If we take that language and apply it here, it's totally fine. And that's not wrong. It's not presentist to do that. because Dick Lewontin is critical of the modern synthesis of evolutionary biology in the same way that Piaget is critical of the modern synthesis of biology. And probably the reason why he moved out of natural history, out of snail hunting and into psychology, is because he was making arguments against Mendel. Although the modern synthesis was still coming together and gets its name and gets solidified in what is it, 42, Huxley's book, The Modern Synthesis. He's swimming upstream. He's swimming against a tide that he can't continue professionally in, and that I think is why he stopped publishing in 29 in biology, and then why also he returns in the 60s when he's participating in the same discourse that Dick Lewontin is participating in. So I think your characterization in that way, if we had described stages that way, no trouble.
Right. So he has this moment, he has this revelation in Paris while working with the Binet-Simon test, and but then he's called back to Geneva to work at this place called the Rousseau Institute. What's the Rousseau Institute, and what did he do there?
He did a couple things at the Rousseau Institute. Becomes later what's now FAPSE, where I worked, the faculty of the science of education and psychology. You get the idea. It's the blended psychology
at the University of Geneva. It's like a faculty in the University of Geneva. Yeah, and so those are integrated, and what exists now is the evolution of the Rousseau Institute. So the founding was in 1912 by Edouard Claparède, the guy I mentioned before, the Swiss functionalist who's buddies with James and Baldwin and everybody. And the Rousseau Institute, which he paid for out of his pocket, by the way, is a combination of an important school, like a preparatory school called the Maison des Petits, where Piaget did studied children and did experimental tasks with them and also collaborated with the teachers. So there's the Maison des Petits, there's a psychological laboratory that Claparède ran with Flournoy, and there's a teacher's college also as part of the institute. And later, starting in 1925, when Piaget had left briefly, there's a diplomatic effort as well. So the International Bureau of Education, which still exists, was founded in 1925. Piaget had gone back to Neuchâtel to take over from Reymond as the chair, the chair that was supervising his second doctorate. So Piaget no longer can work on his second doctorate. And the International Bureau of Education, when Piaget came back in 29, he became the director of the Rousseau Institute and the IBE, both at the same time. And IBE then, much later after his retirement as director in 1968, was integrated with UNESCO. So that's great background. We finally arrive at, I think, what we're really here to talk about, which is what Piaget was really up to. I mean, that's kind of the version, the American version we've talked about, but there's much more to Piaget than appears in most American developmental textbooks, I think. So when he finally started writing about psychological development, even though that is the work for which he is best known in North America, that wasn't really his ultimate aim. He had this larger project in mind about the nature of knowledge, especially scientific knowledge, that he called genetic epistemology. And the developmental work was only one part of that, yes?
Yep.
So what did this somewhat daunting phrase, genetic epistemology, mean, and where did it come from?
Genetic epistemology is the study of the genesis of knowledge. So before I said that he gets the idea of genesis from Baldwin, that's what he means. It's how knowledge is constructed. So he starts with children and ends with science, but modeled using logic. So it's again, the same sort of thing that he was thinking about doing with Reymond for his second doctorate. Now this is 1950 he published. So this is now 25 years after he was not able to complete his doctorate. He's returning, he says in his letters to the Rockefeller Foundation, he's returning to his original interests in philosophy with 25, 30 years of psychological data behind him, with an institute of psychology behind him, with a teacher's college behind him. And he wants to start a new institute that he called the International Center for Genetic Epistemology, where they would fulfill the program that he sort of envisioned way back in the day. The goal really is to make a science of the philosophy of science.
So there's a lot packed into the phrase genetic epistemology. I think first we have to make sure everybody understands that genetic here means basically the equivalent of developmental. It doesn't mean genetic in the sense of DNA that it does today. So he's talking about sort of a development of epistemology, the study of knowledge. I assume that he has some objection to the way in which epistemology had been pursued by philosophers, well, back to Plato, when he decides he's going to pursue something called genetic epistemology, yeah?
Well, there's fundamentally, there's the assumption that there are objects, like philosophers, the philosopher who bangs the table. That's not an assumption that Piaget can accept. It's not a premise he can accept. The fundamental issue that philosophers assume that we can take objects and describe them and then use formal tools from logic in order to produce truth statements is based on a rotten foundation. You can't do it that way. We don't have objects, and also all the tools that you're using, the logical tools, those are things that adults have. Children don't have that. And who's to say that we've always had them? Like, maybe we've always had them, but maybe humans back in the day, we don't know how humans thought, 150,000 years ago, but maybe they developed in their thinking. And if that's the case, well, how are we gonna get to science? How is any of this possible? And the only way to make a science of that is, we can't make up stories about what was or might have been 150,000 years ago. We're going to look at how children do it. That's the program. The issue is, what are any number of philosophical assumptions you can think of, and then we're going to study that for a year. We're going to write 4 books about that thing, and then we're going to move on and study the next thing on the list. That's what the Center for Genetic Epistemology does. So
it seems to me that there are certainly philosophers before him who talked about how we assemble the conceptions of objects. David Hume has this bundle conception. We take lots of different sensations, the apple is red, the apple is round, the apple is sweet, the apple is, all these things, and we bundle all those sensations together, and somehow that becomes the object. So it's not developmental. It's not the how did we get to do the bundling, but there is this idea, this understanding that concepts are constructed. They aren't just given to us innately or something like that. How is Piaget different from that?
He shows how it's done. He talks about Hume. He talks about Kant. The normal way into this story is to engage with the Neo-Kantian side, which is to say, all of the things that are required for us to have knowledge, like space and time and number and causality, all of those things that are assumed to be given a priori, all of them develop. And so each one of those concepts is studied empirically, and all of them show stages of development. So all of these things that we need to have in order to have knowledge, they all develop in the same lineage. They all follow stages. The stages are moved around a little bit, and some of them connect to each other. So you don't get number if you don't have quantity first. Which is a generalization of the conservation studies, and I can't say he, because this is a huge team effort. They get into questions like, how is it that Hume's bundles occur? That's an issue that comes back over and over and over again. So the assimilation, accommodation, equilibration is part of the spooky language of Piaget, right? Is part of the answer to that. The changes that he made in his logic many times as part of that as well. I am excited about a change in his use of Gödel, and that was the hardest thing I ever published. That was rejected 6 times over 7 years. I thought it was the most important essay I had ever written and ever would write. And when my students wanted to do a reading group related to it, I discovered that all of the stuff that was important about that ended up getting cut.
So we're talking about Kurt Gödel, the German mathematician, German-American mathematician, who's
Austrian,
pardon me,
no.
whose most important contribution, I guess, was the incompleteness theorem, right? That system complex enough cannot be both complete and consistent. And he thinks that there's a mapping, Piaget thinks there's a mapping of that onto his description of how children acquire knowledge, construct knowledge.
Not the 1931 version, but the 1958 version, what's called the dialectica interpretation or the functional interpretation
of Gödel.
And Gödel presents that as, let's think about how mathematical proofs are made. Which is to say, how do we make mathematical knowledge? How do we make the thing that Piaget is interested in? And Gödel says, well, in order to consider this, we have to realize that the proof that represents a part of mathematical knowledge is different, and we could say at a separate level than the knowledge of the mathematician, the person who is making that proof, who participates in knowledge about math. So Gödel makes distinctions between different levels and then reinterprets the incompleteness theorems through the different levels.
Right.
And Piaget had a couple of logician colleagues. Everett Beth from Amsterdam is one. There's a bunch of people who are around him and explain what this means. And as part of the Center for Genetic Epistemology, they're all doing presentations. Seymour Papert, who went on to invent the logo. Do you remember that, the computer program with the turtle on it, and you could give the turtle
programming language? Yeah.
So Papert worked for Piaget before Logo. And so he gave presentations about this and incompleteness and how we can conceive of these things. Benoit Mandelbrot, who later invented fractal mathematics, gave presentations about that. Mandelbrot was on Piaget's team at the center, and so they're all reconceiving all of these formal notions as mathematical knowledge and as our understanding of how do we formalize these things. As those advance, they're coming into the system of genetic epistemology, and Piaget reformalizes the meaning of grouping a bunch of different times. And one of the consequences of this thing that I'm excited about is that it completely changes what stages are. It stops being a staircase and it becomes a spiral that's kind of hanging. It's not sitting on anything like a staircase. It's a spiral that hangs from its point, and you can make comparisons across the levels of the spiral. And that becomes a book called Morphisms and Categories, which I think that was published in 92 or 93. Like, this is really, really current new stuff that nobody has thought about. In the secondary literature, it's called Piaget's new theory. I think that stuff is fascinating, but it comes from this change in the formalization, and we don't see any of that in English. We focus totally on the psychological results and the methods, the tasks.
Right. So let's talk about that North American selective interpretation or misinterpretation of Piaget. You know, as I said before, his books are not translated immediately. His early books not translated immediately. They're translated later and into English. And the story of Piaget's uptake in North America is sort of entangled with the dominance of behaviorism in North America. He becomes kind of a figure that cognitive revolutionaries can kind of glom onto as evidence that there's another way of doing psychology. And it's not entirely separate from Piaget. Piaget is highly dependent on American sources of funding, and so has to make nice with the American psychologists who are his advocates there, even if they aren't getting the theory exactly right or only have a small part of the theory. He's getting support from the Rockefeller Foundation. So how important was that to his institute? How much money was he getting from Rockefeller, and who were his advocates in North America?
Rockefeller is how this center happens. And really, Rockefeller is also how the Rousseau Institute was funded. They gave millions, what would now be millions, to the Rousseau Institute, because Claparède, although Claparède was wealthy, he could not fund a whole institute by himself. So Rockefeller took that on. through the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial Fund primarily, but also through other funds. And that continued through to 1939. And then the war happened, so the money stopped. And after the war, the Rockefeller officers are checking in with Piaget. One of them said in the diaries that he went to pay his respects, and early on Piaget kind of blew them off. He was cordial but not loquacious, is one of the descriptions in these officer diaries, because the Americans had kind of forgotten about him. It wasn't until 1950 that his book Psychology of Intelligence was translated. Although that was a series of lectures from during World War II that was published in French in 1947. So that wasn't a delay, but there were decades in between. That was just the first one back. And you mentioned interpreted through behaviorism. Daniel Berline, a famous behaviorist, is the translator of Psychology of Intelligence. So not only is the audience behavioristic, but the translator of the first book back is behavioristic.
Well, there seems to there's sort of a trend among behaviorists, especially Hollians, trying to recast important theories of the past in behaviorist terms. Like there's that famous attempt to turn Freudian theory into Hollian-derived theory by Dollard and Miller. And here we have Piaget's doing something interesting. I wonder if we can cast it in a language which will be seen as appropriately scientific in North America. Is that what you think Dan Berline's doing?
I think so. And Wolf Mays, who was brought in by the Rockefeller Foundation to do a kind of a preliminary investigation of what Piaget was doing. Mays explains that in his report back to the Rockefeller Foundation, saying Piaget is not doing what Hull is doing. Piaget is theorizing what's going on the inside and formalizing, using logic, what's going on the inside, not the consequences of that. But this is an ongoing struggle, and I'm not sure how much Piaget cared initially whether he was successful in the U.S. because the center of knowledge production was still in Europe, and because he was neutral in Switzerland, the war didn't affect him as much. And it's really only after World War II where the center shifts away from Europe to the United States, and he's participating in that. So it becomes an ongoing struggle. He went to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton in 1954, where he certainly met Gödel, by the way, but we don't have any records of them having met. And so he was there for a semester, but Oppenheimer complained that he refused to speak in English, and the Rockefeller officers complained that he refused to speak in English, because for him, it's important to become more aware of all of these people and interact with them more, but Europe is still Europe, and it's only later that America becomes the 800-pound gorilla that we all know.
Right. So the Europeans, especially older Europeans, are not taking the American intellectual scene terribly seriously, even though they appreciate the money that supports their own work. Is that the? Yeah,
and the focus on application rather than on understanding things, like what looks to a European like the drive to do without understanding first what we're doing, like that. And that was a common complaint of Piaget, is that.
Well, I think that, yeah, I think that's really important here, because for how Piaget ultimately loses his funding from Rockefeller, that the stage-wise, development of knowledge in children is something that can be applied to education. Everybody can kind of understand what the point of it is. But this genetic epistemology that he tries to revive for himself, that he does revive for himself, does not strike a chord with the funders and with the people who had been supporting him. And it seems that it also conflicts with some intellectual trends in America as well. He's doing this genetic epistemology, basically psychologizing epistemology, at a time when American philosophy of science is dominated by logical positivists, for whom that approach to epistemology is just anathema. And even the logical positivists' enemy, Karl Popper, although he doesn't like the positivists, is not going to like the psychologization of of epistemology, they have these logical analytic approaches, even though they conflict among themselves. Piaget looks like to them like he's doing something that harkens back 50 or 75 years, right, to the psychologistic crisis in logic. Yeah.
It sometimes is described that way in the letters, and that gets cleaned up and explained that that's not what he means and that's not what he's doing. But there's no discussion with Popper in these records. The big American philosopher they talked to was Quine, and Piaget made the analytic synthetic distinction, what is that? The first dogma of empiricism from Quine's 1951 Two Dogmas of Empiricism paper. They made that a theme for a year, and the question was who's right? Is it Quine or is it Carnap? And they come much more. Piaget comes much more down on the side of Quine over Carnap, and says the distinction between analytic knowledge and synthetic knowledge is blurry. So Quine is right, and of course, it's blurry. It develops. Of course, Piaget is going to come down on the side of the psychologized, of the big philosophers in the United States. Quine being the psychologized one, but Piaget didn't join Quine's camp. There are things from Carnap that he kept. So Quine has this extensionalist view of truth, and Carnap has an intentionalist, not a Dennett version of intention. It's not the intentional stance with a T, it's the intentional stance with an S. Right. So intention comes in as part of the meaning of meaning, and ultimately extension, the thing that Quine supported, was purged completely from Piaget's theory. And actually, this is a connection back also to Kuhn, because Thomas Kuhn did similarly. So the Kuhn and Piaget, and Kuhn is sort of a psychologized philosopher, sort of, and they moved in parallel. Kuhn inherits from Piaget his method, the climbing into other people's heads method. He says that he learned that from reading Piaget on Piaget's children. And that's how he learned how to understand Aristotle. And then Piaget invited Kuhn to join the discussions in 1966, where they were trying to understand what physical causality, how is it that children learn causality? And then they split and started working, and then they continue working in parallel again. That's after the Rockefeller period, but it's the source of the unpublished manuscripts that I found in Geneva, and maybe we can talk about those later.
Okay. So Piaget finally does lose his Rockefeller funding in 1960. It's not a disaster. He finds funding other places, and he's going to live for another 2 decades. He lives till 1980. So what becomes of genetic epistemology in that time? Why is it we still think of, we in North America anyway, still think of Piaget as stage-wise development of cognition, and not of genetic epistemology, a phrase which is almost unheard these days here?
Genetic epistemology in English is best represented by Kuhn, and then people moved on from Kuhn. So why would you need both? We've dealt with that. After the Rockefeller money, there's a further splitting, a further separation. And although he has money from the Ford Foundation, the epistemological works from later in his life, a bunch of them are still untranslated. And they're untranslated on issues that developmental psychologists are talking about now, like what is generalization, what is correspondence, what is, and those are volumes from the series. I think there's 34, 35 volumes from the series.
This is the series on genetic epistemology.
Yeah. So Piaget has the Rousseau Institute journal, Archives de Psychologie, and a bunch of experiments get published there. The annual themes that are examined get published in individual volumes from the Études de l'épistémologie génétique, the studies of genetic epistemology in-house series. And those are paid for initially with money from the Rockefeller Foundation. And those are the books that the commercial publishers didn't care about. So a book by Piaget, okay, yeah, we'll pay for that. And it'll be a commercial success. But all of your weird, extra people who don't have names that are known, but you pay for your own publications.
Right.
The French market isn't that big. So those things then don't get the kind of support that the big books get. And the big books are mostly psychological. So there's some theoretical things, there's some biological evolutionary things. He wrote a book about structuralism that was a bestseller, gangbusters. But he's understood as a psychologist. He's not a scientist of science.
Right. So you've done some interesting work on sort of some digital history research on Piaget and sort of his appearance in different languages. Does genetic epistemology does Piaget appear more as a genetic epistemologist in, say, France or Germany than he does in North America?
I love that study. I'm glad you mentioned it. I hope it will be published soon. In French, Piaget is more recent. In English, Piaget is like a World War II, pre-World War II guy. And in French, he's more recent. So French readers know about Biology and Knowledge, the book from 1967. The French readers are much more aware of the later philosophical discussions. And German readers are much more philosophically engaged. They're interested in his philosophical discussions, whereas the Americans are much more interested in his educational stuff. So it's part of the reconceptualization of Piaget following Sputnik, following the National Defense Education Act, following the shift toward education reform. For Americans, Piaget becomes the science of education, and in French, he's doing something deeper that's evolutionary, and in German, he's philosophical and philosophically interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting historical phenomenon that if you don't speak a number of different languages or read a number of different languages, it's hard to see that this one person is kind of three different figures in three different countries. And I suppose there's an English Piaget and probably a Russian Piaget and Bulgarian Piaget as well. But it's interesting that he really just sort of cuts different figures in different languages.
Yeah, that's totally true. And I'd love to do another study, like who is Piaget in Portuguese, who is Piaget in Italian. And you can do that with him because he wrote so much and he published so much and he's so widely translated. For other people who wrote less, there aren't that many books.
So that's really fascinating background on Piaget. A lot of information for people teaching history of psychology courses that they probably aren't going to get out of their standard history of psychology textbook or even their developmental psychology textbook. They can bring this to their classes. But let me talk about you for a little while and how you came to this place. What's your background? Where were you raised?
I'm from Toronto. And there was I tried to escape Toronto. I wanted to go to UBC or McGill or like just not. I wanted to get out, and I got into Trinity College at the University of Toronto, where my grandfather had gone. And when I told him that I got in, he did a dance, and so when Bubba does the dance, you go to the damn school. Right?
Were your parents academically inclined, or your grandfather?
Well, my grandfather was a pharmacist back when that meant mixing things by hand. His major contribution was he was the only one who knew the formula for Brompton's cocktail, which was a mix of all sorts of things that are now illegal, and it was used for pain management in advanced cancer cases. My parents are both sort of they're academic in different ways. My mom has a master's degree in French existential philosophy, which made my childhood interesting. And my dad, he's from Montreal. He's an Anglo from Montreal, and he went to Loyola College, which is Jesuit, I think, and it's now part of Concordia University. And then he became a journalist. So he worked at the Montreal Star, and then he came to Toronto in the 70s, I think 72. Worked at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is like PBS, and that he was there for 35 years. Ended up as chief editor and boss of the news. And then after that, so he retired from the CBC after 35 years and stayed retired for 7.5 minutes, and then went on to be the head of Al Jazeera English.
Wow! So you go to University of Toronto because your grandfather had gone there. And were you interested in psychology right away, or was that a slow developing relationship?
I went to study finance. I wanted to understand the dot-com thing. I was participating in the dot-com thing, the big stock market bubble. And I wanted to understand how I had no money, and yet people kept telling me that I was worth a lot. So that's why I went to university, to try to understand this. And the bubble was ongoing when I was an undergraduate, but I kept asking annoying questions of my finance professors and economics professors, like, what is a stock market bubble? Why is this a thing? And then, oh God, shut up. We don't know. Go away. It's irrational. A fool and his money are soon parted. Leave. So I left. Like, where am I going?
Yeah.
It's like, who studies that? Psychology, philosophy, I don't know, just not us. Go. So I went and I studied psychology, and but like with a view to understanding stock markets. And it looked like Piaget might be a useful way to model different knowledge about prices and different knowledge about values. So I had this idea that there might be like stages of economic development or stages of knowledge regarding something or other. And I had a professor there who was really interested in Piaget and introduced me to Kuhn and then said, the trouble is that nobody speaks French. And then he looked at me and went, you speak French. Go tell us what's in Piaget that we should care about.
So you get a bachelor's degree in psychology, and you have an interest in Piaget already, and you decide to go into interdisciplinary studies at York University for a master's, yes?
Well, like everything, it's complicated. University of Toronto has this really cool post-bachelor thing where if you want to, you can do a year with no prerequisites in anything as long as the professor agrees. So I looked at my schooling and tried to figure out where my education was lacking. So I did a course in biological anthropology and learned things about monkey teeth. And I did functional neuroanatomy in the med school. And I took a history of biology course at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science at Victoria College. And there I met Jan Sapp, who's a quite eminent historian of biology. And I proposed to him, if he would have me, that I would take his history of biology course, learn how to be a historian using Piaget's biology as a case study, specifically the stuff from the 1960s where he returned afterward. And Jen was really surprisingly supportive. He was like, "Yeah, that's awesome." And this is so that was great. And so we read Genesis, which had just been published, and we went through it like
this is his book, Genesis, on the history of evolutionary theory.
And super convenient for me trying to understand something about genetic epistemology when that's really about genesis of knowledge, right? So this is the genesis of evolutionary biology.
This is a course that he's teaching at University of Toronto, but his main appointment is at York University in the biology department, yes?
Yeah. He's one of these, like us, actually, he's one of these historians who works in a science department, right? He said, look, you can stay at U of T and live in one box. U of T is if you want to be the best at your one box, this University of Toronto is where you want to be. But you're not a one box person. You've got weird interests all over the place. Come to York. York is the place where we do interdisciplinarity. Come to the biology department. Work with me. We'll have a blast. We're going to do history, but we're going to do history that solves problems in contemporary biology. And you can do your Piaget thing and solve problems for whoever cares about that. And then, so I did my master's with Jan and Fred Weissman, who's in the psychology department, and they're friends, and Matthew Clark, who's a translator of ancient Greek. And it wasn't the content of ancient Greek that I was interested in, obviously, but I wanted to understand, like, how do you think about translation in the way that a translator thinks about translation?
Right.
And they like broke me down and put me back together again and introduced me to you. And what did you say about how I tried to get accepted into the PhD program, that it was the most aggressive wooing you had ever experienced?
I think he courted me aggressively. You were in a class of mine. You were in a class on the history of psychology. But so how did your work so you come to the psychology department to do a PhD, and how did your work proceed there?
Initially, I wanted to do a dissertation about what we would now call digital history. And in, I don't know, 2009, 2010, 2011, that was not allowed. I had to put my projects on hold and follow on your coattails as you made the space for that to be publishable. And I mean, I got to participate and I contributed, and you started the lab with Mike Pettit and got great support from the government. And so, we kept the lights on. Yeah. But I got yelled at Chiron for like 30 minutes by John Burnham, who just said, "You're not allowed to use computers." Like, geez, is this how my defense is going to go? So I had all of this stuff about Piaget, and because I'm interested. So I kept pursuing Piaget because it was my interest, but I didn't want that to be my dissertation. And it seemed like computery things would be more likely to find me a life afterwards. And that was wrong. It looked like it wasn't going to be possible. So then I, fell back on all of the interests that I had and wrote a dissertation about the new theory and the parts of the new theory of Piaget that aren't talked about in the secondary literature. And
the new theory is the genetic epistemology. Is that what goes by the name, the new theory?
No, this is like I said, there's a bunch of unknowns, right? So Piaget's social stuff is unknown, the genetic epistemology is unknown, and the late genetic epistemology, what I ended up calling epigenetic epistemology, where it's a blended with his evolutionary biology and weird logic things, although it apparently is not as weird as it looked at the time. And
unknown because they were never published at all, or unknown because they were never published in English?
In English. Yeah. That in Geneva, they know all of this stuff, and they go, why are you so excited? It's very suspicious that you're so excited. And whereas, if you have your formation, if you have your own development inside of American psychology, and you see how Piaget had influence on not only giving us the basis of developmental psychology, but also giving us the basis of education, like most of modern education theory. He's so influential that it's potentially very productive. That there's a bunch more, like there's decades more work that builds on the things that were influential, but it's also like historiographically interesting that we're blind to it. Mm-hmm. And so on both sides, there's like the entrepreneurial me that comes from the .com era, where it's like, this is something that you can, buy food with. And there's the historian side of me who's like, no, seriously, it's interesting that we're blind and deaf, and that it's not only Piaget, it's all of his collaborators and the women. He's so complicated and so well supported with these millions of dollars that he had, and his team is so huge and his interests are so varied that it means that I'm never bored. So you finish a dissertation, it's on Piaget. Now you've got a PhD in the history and theory of psychology on Jean Piaget. And as with all people who graduate from that program, we start worrying about where you might get a job, who would hire a person who knows an enormous amount about the history of Jean Piaget. Did a postdoc. I'm going to skip forward pretty quickly here. You did a postdoc in Geneva in the Piaget archives, where you learned an enormous amount that most people don't know because you saw a lot of unpublished work. But how did you come? And now you're working at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. You did get a job. How did that come about? Trudy de Hude retired. She's very famous here in the Netherlands. She and Douwe Dijksma both are knighted, and Douwe was my boss until he retired. We have mandatory retirement here. Yeah. So there's like a cliff that people kind of fall off of. Yeah. And if Trudy hadn't been forced out, I don't think she would have retired. Because this is a fantastic place to work. For people who don't know, I mean, in English, we can say Groningen, and Dutch it'd be Groningen. We have one of the 3 English language graduate programs in history and theory of psychology. One is yours, One is Simon Fraser in Vancouver, and the other is here in Groningen. So it's like the ideal place for me to land, because everything I teach is related to my research. I don't do anything irrelevant. I don't have to like moonlight as something, well, not even moonlight. I don't have to have the job that we planned for me to have, teaching developmental psychology in 6 different courses. And then in the evenings and weekends, do the things that I'm interested in. I do it all day, every day.
So what new projects are you working on? What are you working on right now?
I'm working on a big grant related to, that I hope the ERC will fund, the European Research Council will fund, related to things that I discovered while digging through the Rockefeller papers, where Quine is arguing against these intentional, with an S, elements in Piaget's theory. And those aspects are supported by, turns out, Dutch philosophers of mathematics. So now there's a research reason connecting Piaget, who is totally irrelevant to the Netherlands, but there's a Dutch connection, and the Dutch connection seems to be fundamental for understanding some of these things that we don't understand about genetic epistemology. So I'm working on that, and I have a handful of other projects because one of the things I learned from Piaget is like, write your thinking down. So I construct narratives, and then as I'm working on other things, I fill in the evidence that's related to them, so that by the time I decide I'm actually interested in working on that thing, it's already half finished. It's really like cheating. It's great. So
strategy. So can North American students study in the Netherlands? Like if they wanted to come and work on the things that you're working on, is tuition the same as it is in the US roughly, or is it less? Or
tuition is expensive. It's, first of all, it's in euros. Yeah. It's a lot of money, and tuition itself is like 17,000 euros a year for foreigners. It's a ton of money. Yeah. But that's to enroll and register and get a degree. If you want to come and visit me, there are lots of other arrangements we can make. We often have visitors, and you came, which was great, and Jamie Cohen Cole came, and Rodrigo Miranda Lopez is hopefully going to come in the fall, and we have exchange students from all over the place. And everybody's welcome. It's hard to get housing here in the Netherlands. There's always a housing crisis, but it's a fantastic team. You've met, everybody has already met Martin Dirksen, or Derksen in Dutch, and Annette Mulberger is our new full professor after Douwe retired. We got lucky and got one of the top historians of psychology in Europe, and Stefan Schleim was a German critical neuroscientist, so he does something completely different, but also engaging with the public about misunderstandings and what the public can't see that they should see. So we're all variations on a theme, and just like the York program, we're open to students who have interests.
Well, that's great. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you very much for spending some time with us.
My pleasure. I'm sorry it was 2 hours long.
So as you can see, I did a fair bit of editing, so it wasn't 2 hours long. But I'd like to thank Jeremy Burman for spending some time with us again. And I'd like to ask you to make comments on the show in the YouTube page. We always love to hear what you have to say. And don't forget that there are show notes on the YouTube page as well, which tell you at what time various portions of the conversation take place, if you'd like to show portions of this to your class or just go back and see them again yourself. The show notes also include references to many of the works and people that we have mentioned in passing in the course of the interview. So that's all for the 8th episode of the History of Psychology show. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you come back in 2 weeks to see us again.